The farmer placed a giant enslaved man as a scarecrow in the plantation, but this time, things unfolded differently, and no one on that farm was ever the same. On Franklin Patterson's farm in the interior of Alabama, the ritual of the human scarecrow had long been a habit. Whenever a slave did something the farmer deemed disobedience, the pattern was almost always the same. First came the pillory and the whip until the skin split open. Then, 3 or 4 days tied to a post in the middle of the plantation, no food, no water, under sun and rain. When they finally brought down the nearly dead man, there was still a final beating, more lashes to drive the lesson home. It wasn't merely punishment. It was a statement. Franklin liked for people from the region to see from the road a body bound in the middle of the corn. To other farmers, he displayed strength. To the enslaved, he showed what happened to those who dared lift their heads. Patterson's farm had a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. When the name came up in town taverns, other farmers would shake their heads with a blend of admiration and unease. Franklin was known as a firm-handed man, a polite way to describe someone who had refined cruelty into a system. He had inherited the property from his father at 25, along with 43 enslaved people and 200 hectares of good land for cotton and corn. Over the next 15 years, he expanded to 87 enslaved people and doubled the land. His secret, according to what he liked to repeat while drinking with other owners, was simple: don't let any of them forget, not even for a minute, who's in charge here. The post in the middle of the corn plantation wasn't decoration. It was pedagogy. Franklin had installed it in his 2nd year after taking over the farm, when a young enslaved man named Samuel tried to escape and was captured 3 days later, starving and lost in the swamp. Franklin wasn't satisfied with merely whipping him. He ordered that structure built in the shape of a cross right in the center of the most visible field and had Samuel hung there for 5 full days. The young man didn't survive. He died on the 4th day, still tied up under the August sun. Franklin ordered them to leave the body for another full day before allowing it to be taken down. So the lesson is clear, he told the overseers. After that, the post stayed empty for months, but its presence lingered constantly in the minds of everyone who worked those lands. It was a silent promise of what could happen. In the years that followed, the post was used at least once a year, sometimes twice, never for serious reasons, at least not in the sense that white law would consider serious. A man who argued with an overseer. A woman seen talking with enslaved people from another farm. A boy who stole an apple from the orchard. Each time, the ritual repeated: whipping, days at the post without food or water, and then the final beating for whoever still had the strength to feel pain. Most survived, but none ever left whole. Some lost fingers to the cold on winter nights. Others developed fevers that never fully went away. Many carried scars not just on their backs but on their souls, a deep, paralyzing fear that kept them from looking any white person in the eye for the rest of their lives. Franklin had 3 main overseers. The oldest and cruelest was Silas Green, a thin man with sunken eyes and a sparse mustache who seemed to find genuine pleasure in others' suffering. Silas had started as an overseer at 18, working for Franklin's father, and now at 42 was practically part of the farm's furniture. He knew every corner of the property, every possible hiding place, every secret trail the enslaved used to move from one place to another without being seen from the big house. The other 2 overseers, Horace and Ezekiel, were younger and less experienced, but they learned quickly from Silas. Horus was big and dull, the kind of man who followed orders without thinking and liked using force because it was the only thing he excelled at. Ezekiel was different. Thin, nervous, always chewing tobacco, with a sideways look that made everyone uncomfortable. He didn't beat for pleasure like Silas, but out of fear of losing his job, fear of being seen as weak, fear of Franklin. Together, the three maintained a surveillance system that seemed to cover every minute of the day. Silas patrolled the main fields. Horus took care of the barns and storage areas, and Ezekiel was responsible for the area near the slave quarters and the path to the big house. There were irregular night shifts, deliberately unpredictable, so no one would ever know when it was safe to move after dark. Gideon was the worst kind of slave for a man like Franklin. Tall, strong, over 2 meters tall, with broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks. The whites called him the giant. Among the enslaved, he was seen as a shield, someone who placed himself in front when the overseer came after a child or an old person. He wasn't insolent, but he also wasn't completely broken. And that, for Franklin and his head overseer Silas Green, was already a threat. Gideon had been bought 5 years earlier at an auction in Montgomery. Franklin needed strong men to open a new planting area, cutting down thick trees and pulling out deep stumps. The auctioneer had announced Gideon as an exceptional specimen, 23 years old, strength of 3 men, good for heavy work. The opening bid was high, but Franklin didn't hesitate. He saw in that body the possibility of expanding production without needing to buy 2 or 3 ordinary enslaved people. In the first months, Gideon worked in silence. He cut more wood than anyone else, carried logs that required 2 men to lift, dug deep ditches with impressive speed. Silas, who normally found reasons to punish newcomers, found nothing to fault. Gideon fulfilled every order, didn't complain, didn't look whites in the eye, kept his head down. But there was something about him that bothered them. Perhaps it was the fact that even with his head down, it was impossible to ignore his presence. When Gideon entered a room or approached a group, people noticed. His size created a gravity of its own, and worse, the other enslaved people began to gather near him. Not obviously, but naturally. Gideon became a reference point. The first time Silas noticed this was during a fight between 2 men over a tool. The argument was heating up, and Silas was already walking with the whip in hand, ready to distribute lashes and end things the way they always ended. But before he arrived, Gideon placed himself between the 2 men, said something quietly that Silas couldn't hear, and the fight simply stopped. The 2 separated, took their tools, and returned to work. Silas stood there holding the whip uselessly. There was no direct disobedience. No one had challenged him. But he felt that something wrong had happened. Someone had solved the problem before him, and that couldn't become the custom. After that, Silas began to watch Gideon more closely. He noticed that children approached him without fear, that older women asked him to carry heavy things, and he always helped, that men talked to him in low voices during the few minutes of rest. None of this was forbidden, but all of it built something that Silas recognized as dangerous: respect. Gideon was becoming a leader without even trying. That's when Silas began looking for reasons. Small things at first. Had Gideon taken a few extra seconds to obey an order? Had he looked the wrong way? Was he working slowly on purpose? Silas reported these observations to Franklin during evening conversations on the porch of the big house, always accompanied by whiskey. "That giant is getting too comfortable," Silas would say, spitting tobacco to the side. "The others look at him like he's something special." Franklin initially didn't pay much attention. Gideon produced well, didn't cause direct problems, and the farm was having a profitable year. But Silas was insistent, and his insistence began to plant seeds of concern in the farmer's head. "A man too big always thinks he can be too big," Silas pressed in one of these conversations. "You know how it is. When they start thinking they're strong, it gets hard to put them in line later." Franklin nodded thoughtfully. He knew the story of other farms where strong enslaved people had become serious problems, rebellions, organized escapes, even deaths of overseers. It all started like this: a man the others respected too much. The official reason for the punishment was the corn that was disappearing from the barn. At night, some mothers went there to take handfuls of grain to make a little more food for their children. It wasn't luxury. It was desperation. The rations distributed by Franklin were calculated to keep people alive and working, but not much more than that. A mother whose child was sick, or a man who worked all day carrying logs, sometimes needed something extra to keep from fainting from hunger. It was a silent survival system that had existed for years. Everyone knew, including the overseers, but no one spoke openly about it because the quantities were too small to cause real damage. Franklin lost more corn to rats and humidity than to these nocturnal visits. But Silas noticed the difference in the measurements and whispered in the boss's ear, "Someone here thinks they can take food from you without paying." Franklin ordered the stocks checked. The difference was minimal, maybe 2 or 3 bags over several months, but the principle had been broken. Someone was stealing, and theft couldn't go unanswered. "Who was it?" asked Franklin, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know for sure," Silas replied, scratching his chin. "But I bet the giant knows. He knows everything that happens there in the slave quarters." It was a lie. Silas had no evidence linking Gideon to the missing corn. But it also didn't matter. He had found the pretext he was looking for. Franklin didn't know who was taking it, and deep down didn't much care. He wanted an example. And if he was going to choose someone to humiliate in front of everyone, let it be the strongest. Get the giant, he decided. If he breaks, the rest break with him. The next morning, Silas arrived at the area where Gideon was working with 4 other men, cutting old logs near the edge of the property. The overseer came, accompanied by Horus and Ezekiel, all 3 armed with whips and one with a pistol on his belt. "You," said Silas, pointing at Gideon. "Drop that and come here." Gideon placed the axe on the ground slowly, wiped his hands on his worn pants, and walked toward them. He didn't ask why. He knew that asking would only make things worse. "Seems like someone's been taking food from the boss," said Silas, his voice drawn out and false. "And I think you know who it is." "I don't know anything, sir," Gideon replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Of course you know," Silas insisted, stepping forward. "Everyone there in the slave quarters tells you things. You're like their king, aren't you?" Gideon didn't respond. He knew that anything he said would be used against him. "Well, since you don't want to help," Silas continued, smiling from the corner of his mouth. "The boss decided you're going to serve as a lesson anyway. Maybe after a few days on the post, your memory will get better. The other enslaved people stopped working, pretending not to look, but listening to every word. Everyone knew what a few days on the post meant. Take him. Silas ordered the other two overseers. Horace and Ezekiel approached, whips ready for any resistance. Gideon didn't resist. He knew that if he did, with weapons drawn and witnesses nearby, he would be killed on the spot. He walked between them, head held high, broad shoulders tense but controlled. As they crossed the farm toward the punishment pillory, the other enslaved people paused in their tasks. No one dared look directly, but everyone felt it. It was as if a shadow had passed over the entire property. If Gideon, the strongest, was being taken, then no one was safe. Before they put Gideon on the post came the first part of the ritual, the whipping. They took him near the pillory, a thick wooden structure installed next to the main barn. The pillory had two holes in the upper part where they fastened the victim's wrists, forcing the body to bend forward, fully exposing the back. Silas, with old pleasure in his hand, raised Franklin's favorite whip and began to beat, back, shoulders, backs of the legs. The leather cut the skin with a dry sound, and blood flowed hot, mixing with the dust. Franklin's whip was custom-made with 9 braided leather strips, each ending in a hard knot. When used well, it not only cut the skin but tore pieces of it, leaving deep wounds that took weeks to heal. Silas started slowly, almost ceremoniously. There was no rush or anger in it. It was method. Each blow was calculated to cause maximum pain without killing immediately. He knew exactly where to hit to open the skin, where to avoid vital organs, how to vary the angle so the strips wouldn't always fall in the same place. Gideon clenched his teeth. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing screams. The muscles in his back contracted involuntarily with each impact, the body trying to protect itself from a pain it couldn't escape. After 10 blows, the skin was already split open in several places. After 20, the back was a mass of torn flesh and blood. Silas paused to breathe, wiped the sweat from his forehead, spat on the ground. He looked at Franklin, who watched everything from a few meters away, sitting in a chair that one of the enslaved had brought from the big house. "How many more, boss?" asked Silas. Franklin didn't respond immediately. He kept looking at Gideon, analyzing. The giant was still standing, still hadn't screamed, still held on to some dignity. This bothered Franklin. He wanted to see that man broken, humiliated, reduced to nothing. 10 more, he finally ordered. Silas smiled and resumed, this time with more force, as if angry at Gideon for still being on his feet. The blows came faster, more violent. Blood began to run down Gideon's legs, forming small puddles in the dry earth. It was on the 28th blow that Gideon finally let out a muffled groan. It wasn't quite a scream, but it was a sound of pain. Silas smiled even more, satisfied. On the 30th blow, Gideon's legs trembled, nearly giving way. When they finally stopped, Gideon could barely stay on his feet. His legs shook, his breath came short, his vision blurred. The world seemed to spin, and only the wood of the pillory holding his wrists kept him from falling. It wasn't just hatred. It was calculation. Franklin knew that a man already beaten, bleeding, feverish, and trembling, would have less chance of escaping after being tied up. The idea was precisely that, weaken before hanging. "Release him," Franklin ordered, rising from the chair. Horace untied Gideon's wrists from the pillory. Without the support, he immediately fell to his knees, hands seeking the ground for balance. Each breath burned. Each movement was pure agony. "Get up," Silas ordered, kicking Gideon's side without much force, just enough to humiliate. Gideon tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey properly. Horace and Ezekiel had to hold him by the arms and drag him more than help him walk. They took him through the farm, passing groups of enslaved people who pretended to work but looked sideways, tense faces, some with tears flowing silently. By the end, Gideon could barely stand. Still, they dragged him to the center of the corn plantation and tied him to the post. A vertical log with a crossbeam forming a cross, wrists tied with thick ropes, arms open, chest exposed, another rope around the waist, 2 more on the ankles. A human scarecrow, just as Franklin liked to display. The post stood in a small clearing in the middle of the field, a spot deliberately chosen to be visible from the road that passed about 200 meters away.